In 2004, a routine archaeological survey here in Driffield Terrace in York, Northern England, uncovered possibly one of the most remarkable finds in recent decades. Beneath the soft, sandy soil, archaeologists found a near-intact skeleton showing signs of a hard life and a violent end. However, as the team began to excavate the area further, they uncovered more and more human remains. A total of 82 burials, with a further 12 cremation urns buried alongside them. Many of the bodies showed significant trauma, such as fractured teeth, healed blade wounds, and, in some cases, decapitation. Most importantly, one skeleton bore what appeared to be teeth marks in his pelvis.
Who were these unfortunate souls to have suffered so much in life and met such unpleasant deaths?
The remains were dated to between the 1st and 4th centuries CE, putting them right at the heart of Roman Britannia. So, I've come to the York Archaeological Trust to find out more about these remarkable finds and what they can tell us about the Roman Empire. David Jennings is responsible for the care of the remains.
David, thank you for having us here today. So can I start by asking you what was actually found at Driffield Terrace?
So Driffield Terrace was 2 excavations where we found a cemetery, effectively. We're in the middle of a big cemetery. We found 82 inhumations and 18 cremations. The bodies were well preserved on the whole, most of them quite well preserved. We had some associated animal bones, and in particular we had some very large assemblages of horse bones associated with some of the burials. So yeah, it was quite an interesting discovery.
So how do we know these are Roman remains?
Well, the first clue, I guess, is the location of the burials, in that they were found in an area where we know there's a really large extramural Roman cemetery that's developed along one of the main roads that leads out of Roman York, and it's been excavated at various times from at least the 18th century onwards. So in one way, when these developments came forward that led to these excavations, we had a pretty good idea there could well be burials there. And then when you look at the burial rite of these people, the way they've been buried, we can talk a bit more about that, it all fits with the Roman practice. You've then got the associated artifacts. We do have a small number of artifacts associated with these people, including pottery, which all indicate a Roman date. So there's nothing to signal that they are anything other than what we might anticipate within this part of Roman York, a series of Roman burials.
And is there anything about the bodies themselves that help us identify them as Roman bodies? Anything that, any injuries or anything like that at all?
Thinking about them in terms of their injuries and their kind of physical characteristics, if you looked at them, you could say, we know that they, looking at the bone analysis, they've had a very hard life. They've got quite a lot of conditions that tell you that they've had periods of malnourishment as children, they've had vitamin deficiencies. We know that they've also had a very, quite a violent life in a lot of cases. There's a very high incidence of broken bones, higher than you get in most Romano-British cemeteries. They've got, a couple of them have actually got bladed injuries, which is again quite unusual. And then I guess the most compelling thing that's really radically different and became very apparent from the very early stages of the excavation is there's an awful lot of them have been decapitated. So of these 82 burials, we've got 40 people that have been decapitated.
Well, David, that sounds absolutely fascinating. And it makes me wonder, what are the implications of all this evidence of what we found and the state of the bodies? What can that tell us about who they were, or any theories about who these people were?
Yeah, so this provoked a lot of, especially the decapitation, provoked an awful lot of speculation over the years, and there's been quite a number of TV programs and documentaries made about these burials. One interpretation is that the people are soldiers. If you look at the demography of the people in the cemetery, they're all male. So all of these decapitations are of adult males. So one interpretation is, could they be soldiers? But then I think you've got to look at some of the other pieces of evidence in terms of the location of the burial, the way in which the people are buried, and then some of the other associated evidence that potentially suggests that the soldier interpretation may not fit as neatly as we might wish. Have we got other elements where we can start to put together a kind of an argument that says, putting those pieces together, we're looking more at something like a group of gladiators?
From the evidence, it's clear that these men lived what we in the modern day would consider hard lives. Gladiators would train with wooden swords to prevent mortal wounds, but with enough force that these could still crack skulls and break front teeth. Wounds we see on several of the skeletons. But what toll would physical training of this kind have on the human body? I spoke to osteoarchaeologist Malin Holst of the University of York to find out.
Malin, you have here one of the skeletons from Driffield Terrace. Who is this particular gladiator?
Well, this has been really exciting, this journey of discovery. We as osteologists and archaeologists try to slowly unravel all the clues that we find during the excavation. So we look at the archaeological context, we look at the artifacts that are found, we look how the individual was buried, and then also we look at the skeleton itself, and we just do that macroscopically, so just using our eyes. And through experience and a lot of learning, we can tell what age they are and what sex they were, and injuries or disease throughout life. And then it's also possible to undertake some biomolecular, so chemical analysis of the bones and teeth, and to look further into the individual to identify perhaps their ancestry, where they grew up, where they lived later in life, what sort of diet they had. So we can sort of piece together all the clues that we find during the excavation and after the excavation about one individual skeleton, and then also about the whole cemetery and also all of Roman York and the wider context.
So it sounds like we know a lot about the skeleton. Do we know its sex and what age the skeleton?
Yes. So through skeletal analysis, we could tell that they were what we call a young middle adult, so aged between around 26 to 35 years, so relatively young. And it was a male individual, and he was about 1.72 m in height, so which is about 5'6", which is the average Roman living height.
Could you talk to us at all about what sort of maladies he may have suffered?
Yes, this individual had quite a lot of inflammation across his skeleton. So he had 2 dental abscesses, so really bad infections, and they really compromise one's immune system and can be quite painful. He also had an inflammation on a rib, on his lower rib cage, and then healing inflammation on the thigh bones and on the shins. And some of those are relatively common, and on the shins we see a lot of inflammation in skeletons from archaeological backgrounds, but the rest are a bit more unusual. And he had a very deep sort of lytic lesion, which is a sort of infectious or perhaps like a cyst type lesion in his hip as well.
What sort of stress injuries did this person suffer from?
The individual suffered from stress lesions in the vertebrae, which are due to sort of axial pressure onto the spine. They're pretty common in skeletons, but we saw a larger number of these and more widespread in the cemetery. So the individual did have stress onto their spine, perhaps from heavy loading or something like that. And they also had an injury to the left shoulder blade, which can occur to stress on that shoulder from training. For example, we've seen it in medieval skeletons from undertaking archery training from adolescence onwards. So it might prevent the two parts of the bone from fusing together, or it can fracture as a result of stress onto the shoulder. And quite a large proportion of skeletons in the cemetery had such injuries. So we think that they're probably related to training in adolescence. Initially, when we analysed the skeletons from this site, we thought perhaps they were slaves because they showed such wear and tear to their bones and also muscular injuries, which are quite rare in your average Roman skeleton. And we see them more often in individuals who undertook heavy labour or in soldiers from archaeological periods. The whole population suggests that they were undertaking either athletic training or some sort of training or heavy manual labour from at least adolescence onwards.
What sort of other violent injuries did this person suffer from?
The individual was decapitated through their neck, to the second and third vertebra of the neck. And we know that their head was slightly forward because the sword or bladed weapon which inflicted this injury also went into the corner of the lower jaw, into the back of the lower jaw. What we don't know is if this injury was inflicted, or the beheading was inflicted, during life, so ended this individual's life, or was inflicted post-mortem as part of a burial ritual.
And is this unusual to have that many skeletons with these types of injuries in one gravesite?
It is, yes. At Driffield Terrace, the site is located along a road leading out of York, and along the whole road, which is now Tadcaster Road, there are cemeteries dating from the Roman period. And I've analysed skeletons from many of these, and many of them are normal sort of average family cemeteries where men, women and children are buried as well, and are buried in coffins, are buried very sort of traditionally. The injuries and the pathologies we see in such cemeteries are very different to those at Driffield Terrace. There are much fewer decapitations, maybe one or two, and there are much fewer injuries, generally much fewer healed injuries, and also not the muscular injuries, or very few of those. So it's a very different picture, even just across the road.
So why do you think he was beheaded?
That's a really good question, and we really don't know. It is fairly common in Roman cemeteries for decapitations to occur, and that can affect women and men and children as well. But only 5 to 6% of individuals on average in Roman cemeteries are decapitated. And in this cemetery, it was 71% when we look at the context and the skeletal injuries together. The heads were often placed between the legs or by the feet, which again is quite common during this period. And we don't really understand this. And that's fascinating about the past, that we don't understand everything. It's possible that this was just a very normal part of burial ritual that we just simply can't comprehend today. It seems very alien to us. But in the past, certain individuals were selected perhaps for decapitation after death. Perhaps it had something to do with the afterlife. We are not certain. The other possibility, of course, is that this individual was decapitated during or after the gladiatorial conflict, and the death was inflicted there in the amphitheatre. But from the bones themselves, we can't see any healing, and healing, well, obviously with the decapitation, healing is not very likely. When we see an injury that has no healing, we can only say it occurred around the time of death, but we can't say that it was definitely the cause of death. Obviously, this individual wouldn't have survived this if it was, but equally they might have died in a different way that affected the soft tissues, which we just can't see from the skeleton.
Was there anything unusual about how he was buried?
He was buried in quite an unusual manner compared to most Roman burials. He was in a triple grave, so buried with 2 other males, and all 3 of them had been decapitated, but our skeleton had the skull in its normal average anatomical position, whereas the skulls of the other 2 individuals were placed by their feet. And triple burials are pretty unusual in the Roman period. They do occur, but they're pretty rare. So this was quite an unusual way of burying this individual, and it's possible, we don't know, that they might have died at the same time or around the same time.
All of these injuries we've talked about indicate a really hard life for this individual. What is it about these injuries that indicate that he's a gladiator rather than a slave?
Most of the clues we have from the skeleton are slightly different, unusual, compared to other skeletons from the Roman period, but they don't make this individual outstanding in any way. However, the individual has got 2 large bites, one on each hip, on the outside of the hip, which were inflicted by a large cat. We probably think that this was a lion, and that is highly unusual, and it really made the distinction between a cemetery where we thought perhaps slaves were buried or perhaps soldiers. This is really the definite clue to suggest that this was a gladiatorial cemetery and that this was a gladiator.
So what sort of injury do the puncture marks on the pelvis denote?
The puncture marks suggest that a lion or another large cat, but most likely a lion, grabbed the individual probably by the hip and dragged them along as they would with other prey. So different animals tend to attack humans or other creatures in different ways, and large cats tend to sort of attack the neck or head area. We didn't see any injuries in this individual in those parts of the skeleton. But the fact that it's on the outside of the hip in both instances suggests that they probably grabbed the individual and dragged it. Whether it was one lion that dragged the individual along the ground, then put her down and grabbed the other hip, or whether it was 2, I don't know, we can't say that, but it does seem to have dragged this individual along, and therefore caused sort of deep puncture marks in the bone of the hip on both sides. It's so significant because obviously lions wouldn't have existed in Britain, and it would have been incredibly difficult and expensive to bring a lion from Africa across to Britain, to keep it alive, to keep it well nourished, and then to keep it here for the gladiatorial conflict. So it's really a very, very precious animal, and would have been highly unusual and a really high status animal to have here in York. I don't think the bite would have killed this individual. The areas that were affected by the bite do not contain any vital organs. It would have been very painful, but I don't think that would have caused death in this individual.
It's really challenging to think, how does somebody get bitten by a lion in Roman York if you don't think about in a context like an arena? Now, the interesting thing about this lion bite is, when we've looked at decapitation, people have always said, well, from what we know from the classical sources, there's no evidence that gladiators were decapitated. And that's true. Now, the interesting thing, though, about this individual who's been bitten by a lion is they've also been decapitated. So, in a sense, if you're using your building blocks, you can start to associate, for the first time, someone who's been decapitated with someone who's been bitten by a lion. So I think that's an interesting, it's not a logical proof. It never is in archaeology, but it puts those 2 facts together in a space, potentially, in your interpretation. And I think that leads me, whenever I'm always asked the question, well, are they gladiators or not? And I know there are many skeptics in the world of Roman archaeology. I still tend more towards the view that I think it's an interpretation that's got more strength than weakness. Yeah, I guess the most significant thing about it is it's just so rare. I mean, we think it's the only instance we've got in the entire Roman Empire of someone who's been bitten by an animal, potentially in an arena. Because I mean, so we have an awful lot of literary sources and other evidence, visual evidence, mosaics and wall paintings and things and testimonies that there were these animal sort of hunts as a regular part of the games. But we've got almost no archaeological evidence of it. So there's this kind of disparity between the literary sources and then the archaeological evidence, which is not unusual in archaeology. And this is one of those really fascinating examples where we all talk about games and we have a good understanding that a standard day at the games would begin with an animal hunt. This was a highly developed part of the games with the very significant issues in terms of like how do you supply all these animals across the empire. But we have very little archaeological evidence. And so this is, we think, the first example of someone who's been bitten by a large cat, a large carnivore, in an arena in the Roman world.
It's really exciting that we have a gladiator cemetery and we can actually prove that this is a gladiator cemetery through the identification of the bite marks, which wouldn't have occurred without a lion. So I think this is pretty conclusive evidence that we have a gladiator here. There are very, very few gladiatorial skeletons that have been found throughout the Roman Empire. There are some skeletons at Ephesus in Turkey, and they have very similar age profile, sex profile, injuries, and evidence of training. So we have a pretty good idea there. There's obviously artifactual and pictorial evidence. At Trier in Germany, some loose bones have been found that have been speculated to be from gladiators, but with loose bones you can't really identify the sex or the age. So we have much less evidence there.
What does that tell us about what type of gladiator he would have been?
Yeah, well, I guess it leads us towards what we call a Venator or a Venatore, who was an animal fighter. So this was the part of the games when, as I say, there was an animal hunt at the beginning, and there were professional troops of animal fighters, Venatores. And so that's the interpretation that I think we sit most comfortably with, that this person is a Venatore.
So would he have been hunting the lion or just straight up fighting?
Well, a lot of what we see in the mosaic shows people who are dressed as hunters, so actually normally not armoured or anything, very lightly dressed. Often they've got a hunting spear. And again, when you look at the representations on mosaics of people fighting, particularly cats, you get the impression that one of the elements of spectacle was that moment when the cat jumps at the person and they have to drive the spear in and kill the animal in that moment of incredible, intense drama, as that animal's almost about to sort of maul them to death, I guess, is the interpretation. So a lot of them got hunting spears. We do see mosaics that show Venatores with whips, control the animals, even clubs. So they have a variety of things, but I think the hunting spear is the thing you see most often, in particular with mosaics with big cats.
Unlike other gladiators, Venatores were professional hunters who would fight wild beasts in the arena. These fighters were not as heavily armed or armoured as their counterparts, often equipped with just a spear, a small metal helmet, and some greaves for their legs. Venatores wouldn't have just fought lions. Ancient sources describe hunts involving bears, elephants, bulls, and even rhinoceros. It was seen as a test of skill rather than strength, and a demonstration of man's mastery over nature. However, the cost of procuring beasts, especially in York, so far from their native lands, speaks to the organisation of Rome in the 1st and 2nd centuries CE.
Here we've got someone transporting large animals across the whole empire. They've clearly come all the way from North Africa to the very northern extremes of the empire. So we do know that there were professional groups, companies that were whose job it was to capture these animals and to transport them across the empire. and we see some fantastic mosaics in the Mediterranean that show people gathering all of these animals up, putting them in crates, putting them on ships. But it must have been a major undertaking. So again, when we were thinking earlier and we were talking about York being connected to this wider empire, it just shows us some of those connections actually in operation.
So you would have had, gosh, big cats and ostriches and rhinos and anything you can imagine. If they could get it, they would bring it here for the entertainment of the Roman citizens of York. Would that be the same for the gladiators as well? Would you have had a diverse range of fighters in the arena?
We've done some isotope work, and there's been some ancient DNA studies done of the population of Roman York, and in particular people have looked at this group of people. The isotope analysis is interesting because it shows that people it shows a diversity of backgrounds for the gladiators. Quite a lot of them could be quite local, but some of them clearly have signatures in their isotopes that tell us that they were brought up in childhood in a very different part of the world. So, for example, our person who's been bitten by the lion, he's got an isotope signature that says he could be from southern Britain, but equally he could just as happily be from southern Gaul, modern day southern France, or even the Mediterranean. There was one person, a smaller study of DNA was done of these bodies, and one of them has got a signature that, a DNA signature that puts this person from the Middle East. They're clearly from, they're right from the Middle East. There's nowhere else they could have come from. So, I mean, in the Roman world, potentially in the province of Syria or something of that nature. And then there's another person where they've been refining the ancient DNA analysis, and they can say that one of the people who was a slight outlier in the first study, they're now saying that 25% of that person's DNA comes from Scandinavia. So you've got someone with genetic heritage outside of the empire who somehow ends up in a Roman cemetery in York. So they've got quite diverse profiles in terms of isotopes and the DNA, which is also very interesting.
We have a lot of diversity in the cemetery, and also this cemetery, when we compare that to the other cemeteries, and even just directly across the road, where we have families being buried, just shows how we have insight into so many different aspects of life in Roman Britain just here in York.
Thanks to the work of dozens of specialists involved in this excavation, we know so much more about where these men came from, how they lived, and how they died. But one thing still eludes us. What did they look like? The vast majority of gladiators were never immortalised in stone or portrayed in mosaics. In 2019, forensic artist Hugh Morrison was invited down to York to help answer this question. Through the measurement of certain landmarks on the skull, Hugh began painstakingly adding layers of muscle and fat onto the bone. Through this process, the team was able to give us a glimpse of how he might have looked when alive. Now, this is only an estimate. We can't be 100% certain on this. Forensic artist Hugh added possible skin tone, hairstyle, and eye colour, but this is as close to what a gladiator looked like as we're going to get.
Often people's stories were depicted in mosaics or on wall paintings, or were written down, but they tend to be either the higher status individuals, or it might have been propaganda. But here we have the absolute evidence, the clear evidence of what that individual or all those individuals from Driffield Terrace have gone through in their lives. So it really tells the human story of the Roman Empire, and particularly of this individual.
So I think the challenge is when you encounter people through their bodies and skeletons, there's obviously the thrill of the interpretation, and it's quite a dramatic story, but it's also obviously in a way a terrible story, and a story of a lot of suffering and pain. And I actually think it's quite important to remember these people were people. like us, just like you and me. And so I think that's always, to me, the interesting thing with facial reconstruction, is that it really brings it home to you that this was a living person, like you and me, had loves and fears and hates. And so that's why I think those things actually have quite an important part, just to remind us. We can become very interested in the science and fascinated by the story, but let's remember there was a human being at the very middle of this, and they had a very difficult time.
Gladiators held a complex position in Roman society. As slaves, they were infamous, considered the lowest of the low. Yet, gladiators also entertained the crowd. They could become rich, famous, and earn their freedom. They were examples of courage and martial skill that Rome prided itself in, a reflection of Roman values in more ways than one. But for every successful gladiator who made a name for himself, there were dozens, perhaps hundreds, who, like our gladiator, lived, fought, and died far away from home to the roar of a Roman crowd. When we think about gladiators today, it's important to remember the human toll that the games were built on, as well as the spectacle and the thrill of legend that the gladiators left us with.